everything kind of stops there or revolves around a ChatGPT type of technology. How much AI is that? And what really is your definition of AI?
The original goal of these AI models was to mimic human intelligence. I needed to make a distinction between AI and algorithms because oftentimes these two are used interchangeably. The results have a certain level of unpredictability. That's kind of the same as human thought if you think about it. We've had Excel formulas for a lot of years, and it's say I go to sum something, I'm going to get the same answer every time. If I take the average of it, I'm going to get the same average every time. That is not AI.
Are we of any use anymore once that AGI is being achieved? How dangerous this type of technology coming in and like taking over the world?
There's a lot of people saying it's going to completely revolutionize everything. There's also a lot of people saying it's going to kill us all.
Does AI have biases?
100%. It's basically the question of, am I going to have a job? That's where I see a lot of this kind of debate happening. People think AI is going to replace them.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the premiere of our new podcast. It's the fourth podcast for Multifamily X, and it's the first tech-related podcast. We found the need to have a dedicated podcast to technology in multifamily, technology in general, maybe not just in multifamily. For that reason, I started this podcast. I should say, it's going to be a different format. Chris Moreno, my partner, and I, we will be hosts, but not co-hosting like the same episode. For those of you, I know it's been short notice. We only advertised this for a couple of days, but we wanted to keep the surprise until kind of the last moment. For those of you that join us today, please drop a line in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from. And if you have any questions for our guest, AI related, trust me, he could handle just about any question that I can think of. With that being said, I do want to welcome our very special guest today, Noah Kenney. Welcome to the show, Noah.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Appreciate you having me.
Noah, I want you to start by introducing yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit about your professional background and, as much as you can, your background related to AI work that you've been doing and you're currently doing.
Sure. Yeah, so I've worked in AI for the better part of a decade. I currently work as the chief scientist at the Disruptive AI Lab. So working on a lot of innovative solutions there, specifically on algorithmic optimization and some image recognition systems. I've done work on large language models, and a lot of that has been in the privacy, security, and ethics side. So broadly speaking, I work on ethical and sustainable AI. I also serve as president of the Ethical AI Forum, which is a global think tank, and we help write some of the policy guidelines, frameworks, and things like that around the ethical and safe development, deployment, and utilization of AI. So I've kind of worked on the qualitative side and the technical side of AI and AI implementation, consulting and engineering on about 40 different AI projects. So happy to dive deeper into any of that, but at least to give a high level.
Yeah, no, I want to start by asking you about the ethical AI organization. Is this organization something that belongs to the government, any government, or is there a NGO?
It's
Is
not.
it like a private initiative?
Yeah, so it's a private organization, runs as a not-for-profit. So we work across industry, government, and academia.
And how does this organization affect, or what's the agenda trying to affect the way AI is implemented at a worldwide level?
Sure. Yeah, so broadly, I see a lot of challenges in government being able to effectively regulate AI technologies, right? And there's several reasons for that, which we can go into the reasons why I think government is not necessarily able to do this effectively. And so, on the flip side of that, I've worked with a lot of companies who call me in to basically say, how do we build safe and ethical AI systems, right? And so, there's a lot of people that really want to build these systems in a way that is safe and is ethical and is sustainable, and don't necessarily know how to do that. And so, the purpose of the Ethical AI Forum is to kind of fill this gap between where regulation ends and where your companies need to get to in terms of that safety, security, privacy, algorithmic bias, economic harms, right? Think of any of these types of harms. And one of the primary ways that we do that is by developing frameworks. And these frameworks are not legal standards, but they provide really strong guidelines. And the way that we do that is by pairing up industry practitioners with computer scientists to collectively write a framework. So let's suppose that you work in biomedicine and pharmaceutical development, and you're trying to figure out how can I use AI in pharmaceutical development. Well, with your background in that, we pair you up with a computer scientist with a background in AI and effectively collaborate to write a framework saying, okay, here's the needs of that particular industry. And here's what can be done from an AI and computer science standpoint. How do we kind of merge these two together, right? And so we work on that. That's a big part of it, writing frameworks and guidelines. The other thing that we do is a lot of education. So we do several events throughout the year. We do a lot of podcasts. We do a lot of writing. We do a lot of everything we do is available to the public. So writing research papers, and we write a lot for industry. So we're really aiming to kind of fill the gap, in people who say, I want to apply AI in my business or organization, but I'm not exactly sure how to do so in a safe way. And we kind of help fill that gap.
What's the extent of your contacts with the US federal government? Are there any conversations with any authority in the US government? And what's the extent of a collaboration, if there's any collaboration at all?
Yeah, so all collaboration is done with individuals. So this is something that makes our kind of think tank a little bit unique. We do not collaborate with any single entity. In other words, if you worked at the federal government, we would potentially collaborate with you as an individual, but not with a specific government agency as a whole, right? So all the opinions of our think tank members are their own. But part of the reason that we do that is because we want to be a global organization, right? And so we're trying to consider the needs of multiple different government structures, right? Not all democracies across the globe, and we have a lot of researchers international as well. So only about 30% of our think tank members are based in the United States. So obviously, the United States is very important from a regulatory perspective, given the amount of big tech companies that are based here. But we're also trying to keep this very broad, where we're considering the global interests and in global risks and harms as well. And so we partner with these individuals from a lot of different government organizations. We've partnered with individuals from the National Science Foundation, the NSA, the FBI. So we've had several different ones that have come in, as well as others in government who are kind of looking at maybe economic harms, right? Or they're looking at just the public policy side and things like that. So our goals have definitely been advanced by those in government, but we don't directly partner with any government agency.
That's a very good point right there. So thank you for that. Now, I do want to go a little bit back. Probably I should have started with this one. What's AI? Because I think the most common perception is that everybody equals AI with ChatGPT, or like a
Right.
standard of ChatGPT that's been developed by Google or by who knows another, like another company, and everything kind of stops there or revolves around a chat gpt type of technology. How much AI is that, and what really is your definition of AI? I want for us to, I want for myself, and I hope that I'm sure that those in the audience will love to hear your definition of AI, since you're an expert in this, and just give us a deeper idea into AI than just chat gpt.
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned ChatGPT, right? Because it's crazy to think that 3 years ago, the vast majority of people didn't have any idea what ChatGPT was, right? And now it's kind of, like you said, what we think of as all of AI and encompassing all of AI. So let's backtrack. I'll kind of go through to answer the question of what is AI. I think we have to look at the history of AI and how that word has changed. So I'll backtrack and I'll go all the way back to the year 1950. And this is a lot farther than a lot of people, kind of think of AI. But the year 1950, a famous mathematician and computer scientist by the name of Alan Turing proposed what we now call the Turing test. And this was essentially a question of, can machines think? Right. That was the fundamental question of this paper. At the time, Alan Turing actually said that the question was, quote, too meaningless to deserve discussion. Right? It seemed so far away that it seemed meaningless to even discuss it. Well, just 1 year later, in the year 1951, a researcher by the name of Christopher Strachey from the University of Oxford built what is now considered the earliest successful AI program. right? And it just goes to show, we think now advancement happens so quickly. Advancement was happening quickly in the 1950s, right? So first program was built in the year 1951. Now, obviously, we've advanced a lot since then. But at the end of the 1960s, you had AI models that were capable of playing chess and capable of playing checkers. And so the original goal of these AI models was to mimic human intelligence, number one. And partly based on Alan Turing's question he proposed, is to develop a model that's capable of thinking, right? And that kind of becomes a philosophical question of what does it mean to think, and that goes into consciousness and a whole other direction that we can go in there. But to refer specifically to your question of what is AI today, right? I need to make a distinction between AI and algorithms, because oftentimes these two are used interchangeably. And an algorithm is a set of processes. It's a repeatable set of processes, right? It's a step-by-step ordering to how something is done. AI, one thing that kind of distinguishes it is that the results have a certain level of unpredictability that come into play there, right? And that's kind of the same as human thought if you think about it, right? So I can't predict exactly what you are thinking at a particular moment, right? Now, based on the conversation we're having, I maybe have a sense of what direction you're going in, or questions you might have, or things like that. But I don't know exactly what you're thinking. There's a level of unpredictability that comes with the way that you're thinking. And that level of unpredictability exists for you too, right? So it's not just that I can't perceive it, it's that you don't necessarily know what you're going to be thinking of in 10 minutes, right? So so there's that level of unpredictability, and that's a distinction between AI and algorithms, right? Algorithms are these repeatable step-by-step processes. Now, AI today looks a lot different than it did in the 1950s and the 1960s, right? I think what we see the most use out of right now are these large language models like ChatGPT. And a big part of the reason why we see so much use out of that is because we are a language-based culture, right? And so it's a natural form of communication. And that's really why so much of the general public views ChatGPT as kind of the extent of AI, right? Because it's accessible. You can use it without any specialized training. You can communicate with it in the same way that you've learned to communicate since you were a baby, right? And it's very easy to use. But there's a lot of additional types of AI. There's AI for algorithmic decision making. So a good example of that would be a bank that's trying to figure out who they should lend to, and you're trying to make that decision using AI. There's examples in image recognition. That's a very common use case, right? And that can be used in a whole bunch of different kind of sectors. So I've done work on that with everything from healthcare for medical imaging to reading license plates for issuing traffic tickets and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of different things you can do with image recognition. And then there's this data analysis, right, and pattern detection. And so that would be things like you have an Excel file with a whole bunch of data in it, and you're trying to determine the pattern. And most people take that a step further, and they want to determine how to optimize for something. So this would be transportation, logistics, manufacturing, quality control, to things like analyzing marketing data and web traffic data. So at a high level, the three types of AI that I hear talked about the most, and there's a lot of other types in specific model architectures, but the three types I hear talked about the most are these large language models, image recognition models, and then kind of data and pattern analysis, right? And that's kind of how I view AI today. And of course, it's evolving continually, but I think today that's kind of where we are.
Can you think of a couple of simple rules for someone to look at a product and say, is this AI technology or it isn't? What are some characteristics that are differentiating real AI from technology that's being perceived as AI incorrectly?
Yeah, so one would be that if you put in an input, there should be a different output each time that you put in the input. It might be off by a very small margin, right? So, for example, if I put in an image for image recognition, it may be that I get basically the same probability, right, each time. But if I put in a different image, I get a different probability, right? So there's some nuance that comes in there. Same thing with a language model. If I put in a certain prompt and I put that prompt in 10 times, I'm going to get a different output each of the 10 times, right? Now, it might be very similar. Right? It might be off by a couple of words. The core idea is going to be the same, but there's some variance that comes in there. Now, let me provide an example of kind of the opposite, right? Because I think it helps make this point. So what about an Excel formula, right? This is not AI. Right? We've had Excel formulas for a lot of years, and it's, say I go to sum something, right, in the Excel file, I'm going to get the same answer every time. If I take the average of it, I'm going to get the same average every time. That is not AI, right? Now, some people might make a counter argument. Well, what if I upload data to ChatGPT and I ask it what the average is? I'm going to get the same answer every time. Yes, but the language that's used to convey that answer is different. The AI is not found in the mathematical analysis, right? The AI is found in the language analysis. So that is a distinction that's made there. Math is math, right? Whether it's outputted by an Excel formula or it's outputted by ChatGPT. So to be clear, AI doesn't have to be wrong, right? So I think when I say sometimes that there has to be this variance, people think that sometimes your averages should change or the sum should be different. That's not the case. But there's going to be some variance in how it's actually displayed and presented, right? Same thing if you work on image recognition. You may upload an image and the probability of a match to a certain data set is between 0 and 1. Right? And you may put it in and you get a match of 0.847. And then you go and you put it in later and it's 0.852, right? It's just changed slightly. Now, for your purposes, it probably doesn't make any sort of difference, right? But I think it is helpful to look at the things that are not AI, things like I said, like an Excel formula. There's also these recommendation systems powered by AI, and these are ones that people use kind of in the background every day and don't realize it, right? It's AI that's determining which route is best for you to take when you put something into GPS. It's AI that's recommending what movies you might like and what music you might like. And your recommendations are going to be different than my recommendations. Right? So when you see something like that, there's some level of intelligence that's going into those recommendations. Now, that's different than, for example, you click on a product and it says, here's an upsell to the product, right? Well, that might not be based on any form of intelligence. But when you see recommendations where it says, here's tailored recommendations for you, that is using some form of AI in the background, right? So, and to be completely clear, there's no standard definition for what AI is, right? We're kind of still writing that definition in a lot of ways. And so, that may kind of change and evolve, but that's what I think, as of now, at least.
I do want to say hi to Ken from the audience and pull up his comment saying that we have only weak AIs now. Great interview. Maybe one day we will get AGI. So
Yeah,
what's your take? First of all, I don't know what AGI is. Is this something that you would you would like to spend a little bit of time on?
sure. Yeah, so I'll explain first what AGI is. So AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. And this is commonly compared to narrow intelligence in an AI system to provide kind of what does that actually mean, right? Well, AGI, we effectively are saying an AI model that is the sum of collective intelligence of a person, right, or of humanity as a whole, versus narrow intelligence, which is intelligence in a specific use case. So if you build an AI model to recommend movies, let's say, that's an example of narrow AI. Right? It solves one thing, it does one thing. That's what it was designed to do. It was designed to recommend movies. It's not Netflix's system to recommend movies. It's not all of a sudden going to start spitting out language, right? So it's designed for that one task. Same thing in healthcare. If you design an image recognition system for some sort of medical imaging, another example of narrow intelligence. Now, large language models like ChatGPT are pushing towards this concept of AGI, which is effectively when we say that different people define this different, but the collective definition from the people that I talk to view it as when we can say that AI basically contains the sum of human knowledge and would be a better equipped to answer a question, say, versus a human, right? So right now, we're seeing that ChatGPT still has a lot of limitations, right? It still has hallucinations. It still has inaccuracies. Sometimes it just doesn't know how to answer questions, or it lacks understanding of real world concepts and things like that. But we're pushing a lot closer to this. We've gotten a lot closer than we've ever gotten. And if you ask people, they say we're anywhere between, usually I hear somewhere between 1 year and 15 years away from having true AGI. But it's definitely something that we're getting fairly close to. And that's basically a point a lot of people are very excited about, but also a point a lot of people are very concerned about, because some people have concerns about what place that leaves for kind of humans in society, right? If we have AI that's actually smarter across the board than us. So happy to go in whatever direction you want there, but at least provide a high level overview of the differences.
I'd love to take you to your assessment of AI, because you said, that begs the question, are we of any use anymore once that AGI is being achieved, right? So I want to ask you, how do you personally perceive AI, and how dangerous, if there's any danger to this type of technology coming in and like taking over the world pretty much?
Yeah, so I'll start with the dangers and then end on a positive note here, right? So I think a big part of this comes down to how you define dangerous. And what I tend to see a lot is that there's a lot of hype in AI, right? There's a lot of people saying it's going to completely revolutionize everything. There's also a lot of people saying it's going to kill us all, right? And I spent a lot of time working on the dangers and the safety aspects of AI. I land somewhere in the middle. I don't think that it's going to destroy humanity. But I think it's a technology that definitely does have dangers, right? And part of this depends on how you look at those dangers, right? So, what are the dangers of social media, for example? I think even just over the past 2 or 3 years, we've seen lots of studies coming out about how it's damaging to mental health, it's damaging to kids, it's leading to issues with self-image and things like that. So, is social media dangerous in terms of is it killing people? I mean, I wouldn't make that argument, right? But is it dangerous in other ways? Perhaps, right? So I'll make the same sort of disclaimer with AI. I think there's a lot of different types of danger. Broadly, I think that there's 4 types of dangers. One would be physical dangers. 2 would be the danger of misinformation. 3 is the danger of polarization, that could be political or otherwise. And then 4th would be the danger of data misuse, and that would encompass privacy and security. So looking at what a lot of people think of when they think of those dangers is physical dangers. I don't personally see huge risks of AI in that area. These models take on the parameters that they were programmed with, right? And the disclaimer I always make here is these models can have good intent. They can be programmed with good intent and still do harm. I think a lot of people kind of assume that these models have to be programmed with ill intent, and that's really not true. And the analogy I typically use there is of ants. If you're outside and you're walking and you are optimized to get from point A to point B, you may step on ants as a course of just kind of taking your steps, right? The course of action and taking your steps. You didn't set out to kill ants, but just in getting from point A to point B, in kind of the way you're programmed and the way that you're optimized, you are going to kill an ant if you step on one, right? And you probably won't even be aware that you did it. So that's kind of a fear with AI is you can look at it as AI being the human and us being the ant, right? And what if it's programmed for a good purpose, but it leads to harm? So take global warming, for example. Let's suppose that we said we have achieved AGI at some point, and we want to use that AGI to solve global warming. And it starts to do kind of logic and reasoning on it, and it goes, okay, well, global warming is caused primarily by carbon emissions. Carbon emissions are caused primarily by humans. And therefore, if we got rid of all the humans, we'd solve the problem of global warming. And as humans, we think about this different, right? We think of the problem as being vehicles, for example, right? We don't think of the problem as being the user of those vehicles. And an AI model will think about that differently, right? Because it doesn't understand the notion of humanity. And when I say that, a lot of people tell me, well, just program that in, right? That we have to preserve human life. And that sounds very conceptually simple. But what about war and conflict? How do you handle situations like that? And what about animals, right? I mean, not everybody, but a lot of people eat beef, for example, right? But in America, you would not eat a household pet like a dog, right? But there are countries where they do, and so we have kind of this different. And same thing in India, cows are very respected, right? And we eat them here in America.
They're
So
holy.
yeah, I mean, right. So you've
Oh,
got these
that's
huge,
that's where the
yeah,
word is coming. They're roaming around like they're not. Nobody's stopping
exactly.
them. They really are holy.
Yeah, right. So how do you program an AI model, right? That kind of encompasses all of these different values, right? And that's where AI can become dangerous. It becomes dangerous when you have somebody who's programming those values, and those values don't align with your own values, right? That's where it becomes dangerous. It becomes dangerous because the AI model doesn't understand the sanctity of human life. It doesn't understand real world dangers and implications. It can't be scared, right? And ultimately, it doesn't think in terms of a short timeline, right? So it kind of has this infinite time horizon, if you will, to accomplish whatever goal that it's programmed for. Humans tell it to do so quickly, right? But if it messes up, it doesn't really have a concern about that. It learns from it and then it changes it in the future, right? But it's kind of learning with us, and we're kind of the first generation that it's learning on. So potentially there's some dangers that come in there, but I'll kind of make another argument there before getting to the positive side, which is, George Hotz, he proposed this idea of having two life stacks. And the life stacks are basically the biological life stack, and then the computational life stack. And I've actually published a paper on this as well. And basically looking at, what's fascinating is that we fear the life stack that we created, right? This artificial intelligence. Um, but the limitations of both stacks is unknown. Right? We actually don't really know what the limitations are, and I think it's easy to think that we know more of those limitations of humans, but we really don't. Every civilization is becoming more advanced than the last, right? And so the sum of knowledge that society creates in a year now encompasses more than all we've created in the history of civilization. Right? Every single year, we're creating more data than we've had in the past, however many years that the civilization has existed. So we don't know the limitations of the human stack. We don't know the limitations of the intelligence stack. But we fear the computational intelligence stack that we created, and so that's potentially a concerning thing. But I make the counterpoint that we don't understand humanity either. We don't agree with the values of every human, and so is it more dangerous than what we currently know? Not necessarily. You can look at autonomous vehicles as an example of this. Autonomous vehicles are now more accurate, less accidents per 100,000 miles than a human driver, but people still don't trust them. What happens every time an autonomous vehicle crashes is there's a news article that comes out that says Tesla crashed into vehicle, and they always blame the car, right? And you see these news articles every single time. Well, if I'm driving a vehicle that's not autonomous and I crash into a car, unless it's some massive accident, you're probably not going to ever know about it in the news, right? So people are perceiving the dangers as higher, say, of an autonomous vehicle, but it's actually statistically safer, but we still don't trust it. So why don't we trust it? We don't trust it because it's not a human, right? We think we understand humans. And so, a lot of people say, I trust a human driver. Well, the human driver might be tired. They might be drunk. They might have a seizure, right? You never know what is going to happen. And so Humans are unpredictable. AI is unpredictable, but statistically, in that particular context, the AI is actually more accurate, it's safer, and people still don't trust it. So there's kind of this perception aspect. Now you ask the perception of this, right? Is it positive? Is it negative? I have a positive perception of AI. I really do. I think that this is like every technology that's come before it. It's occurring on a much larger scale. It has much larger capabilities than we've ever seen before. So I acknowledge that there are differences and there are nuances that come with this technology. But I do think there's a lot of good that comes from it. I've been fortunate to have a lot of hope that comes specifically from my work in healthcare in AI and seeing the potential to save lives with it, but also just to take on some mundane tasks that people don't want to do. Right? I think there's a lot of really positive things here. And the last point I'll make on that is most of the people I talk to, even in these large big tech corporations, they want to see AI used in positive and safe manners. Ironically, my greatest hope for AI comes from conversations with humans and realizing that the people building these models don't have malicious intent. The harms that come out terrify them as much as they terrify the media, and they're working very hard to fix these things. And so I think that's evidenced by the fact that I have a job working in AI safety, right? So my biggest hope for this just comes from seeing all these people working extremely hard to make it as safe as possible. And that doesn't mean that there aren't risks, but I don't have concerns of like wide scale dangers that come from this long term. I really don't.
Noah, does AI have biases?
100%. So let's start with the data there, right? Of who is actually building these models. If you look statistically, 90% of the people that are building those models are male. 90% fall into the middle-aged category, right, loosely defined middle-aged category. Most of them are in the upper income level. Most of them are very liberal politically. And these are not absolutes, right? But I'm giving there's statistical data for all of this, and anybody who wants to see it, I'm more than happy to send over the studies. But if you look at companies like Meta and you look at companies like Google, most of the people that sit in those conference rooms are going to have that kind of certain demographic data. Now, that doesn't inherently mean that a model is biased, right? But it does end up leading to bias in these models. But I'd gone into a company that was doing some work on physical hardware to scan people's faces. And I got to see the scanner, and I wasn't there to look at the scanner, but I got to see the scanner, and it's very cool technology. And at the end of it, I said, why is this not on the market? And they said it was on the market. And we pulled it after like a month. I said, why did you pull it? And they said, because we realized that it wasn't capable of identifying anybody's face who was not white. I was like, how did it get all the way to market before you realized that? And they said, because our entire development team was white and we never realized it until we brought it to market. That happens a lot, where there are certain types of bias that are built into these algorithms based on who trained them and based on the data that they are trained with, right? There's an additional type of bias that comes from the users of these models. And I don't think everybody necessarily realizes this, but when you're using, say, ChatGPT, you are helping to train that model. Right? They have what's called reinforcement learning built into the model. And so you are helping to train it when you use these different models. And think about who's using AI technologies, right? These are early adopters that are using it. Right? They're more technology savvy people. And depending on the AI model, you have people using it who say are in the workforce, right? You can look at the demographics of who's actually using these tools, and they're training it and building in additional biases, right? So there's a lot of different types of bias there. And here's why the model itself is not inherently biased. The data is usually the issue, right? So that can come from you saying, I'm going to build a large language model. You as a human have to determine which data you're going to use to train that model. So if you're building a model and you want to train it on political data, which news organization do you choose? Right? You can choose Fox, you can choose CNN, you pick your news organization, you're going to have an inherent bias. Now again, there's bias, but is that bias different than what we have now? Right? It's trained on data that humans wrote. It's trained on human biases. Here's what's different about it. You don't know the bias. And so the great thing right now about kind of bias, say, in the media is you might know the bias of each media organization. And so you can read, say, an article from a traditionally conservative media publication and say, okay, well, I'm reading this through the lens of they have a conservative bias, right? And same thing on the liberal side. So as a human, you kind of have a filter of how to view these things. And when you get data outputted by an AI model, this is where I think it is more harmful, the bias. You don't know what the bias of that model is. You don't know who trained it. You don't know what data it was trained on. And so you get this kind of notion of a black box. And that to me is where this is kind of different from other forms of bias we've seen before, because you can get an output and the output is going to seem like fact, and you have no idea where that quote unquote fact actually came from. So very different.
This takes me to a different area, close to the bias conversation. I grew up under a totalitarian regime, and that was communism. That was the most evil ideology that the human mind has invented, and it killed the most people worldwide. But what that basically is, like, if I was to pull myself out of, like, being part of that experiment, is social engineering. It's what it is.
Sure.
You try to engineer a society, and it's been proven time and time again that those extreme ideologies, as well as socialists, just don't work. They're against our human fiber. Now, going back to AI, and you mentioned that most of these models are being built by people that have left-leaning biases.
Right.
With that type of bias built in, what is the danger of, like, society being pushed towards some social engineering experiences, and what are some ethical issues that we could bring up to possibly have that conversation before it's too late
Right.
to reverse this process?
It's a great question, and it's definitely not a secret that there's a lot of political division. Right? I personally think that there are a helpful debate, right? Of I can have my beliefs and somebody can challenge them, and either I have to actually go back to the evidence and the data to support my belief, or I have to admit that I was wrong, right, on that particular thing. And so, to me, we definitely want to look at data, right? We don't want to necessarily incorporate as many opinions in AI model development. And I see a lot of right now, what are AI models trained on? A lot of it is opinion based content, right? Now, I'll give a couple examples in the context of large language models and how this kind of relates to your question specifically. So ChatGPT was trained primarily on Wikipedia, which is user generated content. Anthropic has a model called Claude that was trained primarily on Quora forum, which is also user generated content. Elon Musk's model Grok was trained on Twitter tweets. Additional models have been trained on Reddit content. So the point is the vast majority of content that's being trained in these AI models is user generated. And so you can kind of determine how biased each of these platforms are going to be based on how it's trained, right? So to me, Wikipedia probably has less bias than, say, Twitter. Twitter tends to lean a lot more left. Wikipedia tends to focus more just on facts and data. That's kind of anecdotal, right? There's definitely exceptions to that, but the purpose of Wikipedia is to provide fact, not opinion. So I think there's a very smart strategic decision by OpenAI in choosing to train on Wikipedia versus Elon Musk's Grok model training on tweets. Right? I think you're going to get a lot more left wing bias that comes from training on tweets. So that's a kind of note I'll make in terms of part of how we fix this problem is we have to train on the right content. Right? We have to train on factual content, even if that content is user generated. So kind of one thing. Now, more specifically to your point, how does this impact society at large, right? Because, and how does it impact our government structure, I think is really kind of what you're getting at there. It's unclear as of yet, really, right, how it's going to impact the government structure. I think we've seen before what happens when people are kind of in an echo chamber, right, where they're saying something and all they see is stuff that they agree with. A good example of that is on social media, right? The algorithms for a long time were favored, so you would only see content that you agreed with. Now, every now and then, the algorithm will show you something that it knows you'll disagree with to get your engagement on it, right? And so, what I've seen a lot is that people either want to see content that they really agree with for purpose of education, or they want to see content that they really disagree with to engage with it and to disagree with it. And what most people don't really seem to want is content that's kind of in the middle, right? Content that they maybe agree with the premise of it, but there's specific things that don't exactly align with their values or ideologies. So how do you translate that back to if you're building a model, for example, right? Again, this is where the role of humans comes into play, right? That there has to be restrictions around, how these models are used in contexts where they impact people beyond their choice. Right? And to kind of clarify what I mean there, if you want to use a model by choice, then I don't know as though bias is an awful thing in that model as long as you're aware of the bias. So, a person who's kind of leaning left wing and they have a model that is leaning left wing and they know that and they are fine with that bias, I don't really think that is a problem for them to engage with that model. I don't think it's any different than what we currently have with them engaging with other people on social media and things like that. So I don't necessarily see a harm there. Where I see harm comes if we have a model that is used by everybody and that model has some level of increasing bias over time that we're initially unaware of. Because over the course of, say, 2 or 3 generations, that bias can change a lot. And so if each year the model gets, suppose that we could quantify this, and each year the model got 1% more bias, right? Over the course of the next 200 years, you have a model that is now extremely biased, but you also have a generation that never knew what it was like not to have that bias. And so that's where I see that the harm coming in is if you've got one central model that everybody's using and you don't have a way to quantify that bias. And so it's kind of the second part of your question, basically, what do you do about this? Big part of it is education. Right? People have to be educated about how these models work. A lot of people don't know how they work. And that leads to some considerable risks that come into play there. So you definitely have to know how the models work, how they're designed with bias in there. The other thing is we definitely need to expand access to who's working in AI. And this is something many before me have talked about, but I mentioned it. It's not very diverse right now. And if you really want to create a model that represents society more broadly, then you have to have people working in the field who are speaking up about these values that they have that differ. Right? You have to have this healthy conflict and debate. You have to have people on both sides politically that are having conversations so that you land in the middle. And that's where I say you don't want anybody to be completely happy. When you have somebody who's completely happy with the way that the model works, 100% of the time you're happy with the thing that the model says back to you when you put a prompt in, then it's probably aligning too closely with your ideology. Really what I want to see is people that disagree with each other all collaborating to work on this. And the effect that has is, number one, it slows things down. And that's actually, I think, a positive thing. A lot of people have talked about slowing model development a little bit. And I think that that's a smart thing to do. I'm not a fan of pausing development. If you recall, there were times where people were signing letters saying, we just paused development for 6 months. That doesn't solve a problem. Right? Pausing just delays a problem. What does solve a problem is spending that time having these debates. Right. And if you've worked in these teams where you've got people of different interests all talking about a problem, it takes a lot longer to solve it, but you generally get to a better solution. And that's what I think we really need to be able to solve this and avoid the situation you're talking about of drastically changing government structure and stuff like that.
You mentioned the press. and the right leaning left and also social media. Now the biases in press, in the media, they're very well known, right, for most of
Right,
the
right,
population that reads and has common sense. So we know what type of content we're watching. Social media, it's a little bit more of a, in my opinion, perverted method, because it caters to the same thing as legacy media caters, but it's in a more
sure,
perverted way, right? Because it's a lot more addictive. And like you said, it's looking to generate interactions, to generate reactions.
right,
Therefore, the polarization of the society, becomes bigger and bigger, although probably like a percentage of, like, maybe, I'm guessing, right? I'm just making up a number, 70% of the population, or 80, it's right in the middle, right there, that they have the same values, like, core values. They're kind of like, they want to raise their children safe, right? They don't want them to, die of, some disease. They want them to be healthy. They want them to consume, clean water, clean air. They want to have a great education. I don't think that there's any disagreement, right? And even on the fringes,
sure,
people are not going to be, I can imagine like a sick person saying that, my child, I don't want this for my child, a great education. Now,
right,
what that does is that these extremes are becoming the noisiest, right? The quiet, what we call, I guess, the quiet majority, it becomes quieter and more. They see this, all the social media spectacle as a more repulsive. Therefore, they retract back in their shells. And what's taking over the public discourse, it's the fringes. Whether
right.
it's the left one or the right one, and there's not much left in between, not much reasoning. And I'm thinking, right, how do we as a society solve this? And I'm seeing this coming, like, in a near future, in a very not so distant future, as happening with AI technology as well, for different reasons, for different reasons, I should say. And it's the reasons that we've discussed, I brought up and you brought up earlier on. But what's your take on this? How do we mitigate this? How do we go back to being civil again, and talking to each other, and actually disagreeing respectfully, and then coming up with letting the best ideas win, versus I have to be right?
This is my opinion on the matter. I think that you have to have a lot more people talking face to face. I think, from everything I've seen, things escalate a lot online. People disagree with people. People disagree, and this is what I think is somewhat sad. People disagree on the words that somebody's saying without considering the values behind why they're saying them. And so, there's a lot of cases where everybody, I kind of go to this philosophy of everybody believes what they believe for a reason. Online, very few people take the time to understand why somebody believes what they believe. And I think when you understand the personal experiences that somebody's gone through, I'll use what you talked about as an example with your upbringing and politically, right, and that government. That's going to shape how you think about government in the United States in the current context, right? And fears that you have about that. And those are going to be different from somebody who's lived in the United States their entire life and has never, been outside the country. And it doesn't make either of you right or wrong, right? But you have a specific reason for, here's why I have a fear of this particular thing. It's rooted in, I've seen it and I've seen the destruction of it. And so here's what I want to avoid, right? And you kind of put that out there. And right now people spend so much time trying to debate the problem and not a ton of time trying to figure out what an optimal solution looks like. And so a lot of times people will come forward and say, here's what I think the solution should be. Maybe that solution, it doesn't work for a particular reason, right? But if you instead share, here's what I want the future to look like. Say you have kids and you want to make sure that they receive a quality education. This is a debate right now of, do we use AI to educate kids? So that's a huge question that's going on. And you and I could have a debate online where you say we should use AI to educate kids in the following way, and I say, no, that's never going to work, and here's why. Right? And to be clear, I'm not of that opinion. I'm just saying, as an example, right? Like, we could have some sort of discourse about that, and we're debating now: is it practical to implement? And before you know it, it becomes a question of, what is the cost of it, and what about the teachers who are out of jobs, and what about? And now we're debating, gosh, you don't care about the teachers, right? And before you know it, we've escalated to a point where we're just at each other's throats and it's so tense. And if you sit down and you go, here's my kid, and I want to make sure my kid has a bright future. And to me, that means that they need quality education. I think AI can help with that, right? Or I think AI doesn't help with that. Really, now the question becomes, does AI help the kid have a quality education? And now it's the two of you against the problem. And I think right now it is person against person instead of two people against a problem. And what happens, at least from what I've seen, when you debate people and you share your values with them and you say, I start with, I may be wrong, but here's my basis for what I believe, because you may be wrong, right? And I think, how rare is it that people actually admit, I don't know, but this is my opinion. And here's what my opinion is based in. And if you can present a counterpoint, I will accept your opinion, right? When you go into this debate and you've got a closed mind, it's futile. You're debating for the purpose of engagement, right? You're debating for the purpose of filling your time. You're debating because you just want to do it for the fun of it and to antagonize another person. It's so futile. But when you genuinely go into a debate saying, I want what's best for my family, I want what's best for society, I want what's best for my community and for me personally, and these are the views that shape the way that I think. And I'll tell you just how that plays out in my own organization as a super quick, simple example. When somebody new joins my team, I have a document called a README document. And the README document, it describes my background. It describes my personal values, my beliefs, and my biases. And I provide them with that document because I say every single thing that I say, I want you to view through this lens. I want you to know my biases so that you can counteract them. I want you to know my values so that you understand where I'm coming from. And I want you to know why my perspective and my opinions are what they are, because I can't turn off my biases. But if you know them, you can better address them in me. And so every person coming into my team sees this background of, here's why I think the way that I think and why I am who I am today. And for me, that's a super simple thing in my organization for people to actually be able to understand me better. And I think that doesn't happen enough online. It doesn't happen enough in organizations, and it doesn't happen enough in conversations where somebody says, I have this traumatic thing that happened to me and I'm afraid that it's going to happen again. And I will do everything in my power to make sure it doesn't happen again. And so when you know that is the root of why you think what you think, and somebody else doesn't know that, then when they say, I disagree, it feels like a personal insult. It feels like they're diminishing what you've maybe gone through in some traumatic fashion. But when you share it with them and they respond with some level of empathy and you understand that they really want the same thing you want, right? Most people want their families to be healthy. Most people want to be financially free. Most people don't want political or religious oppression, right? There's a lot of, most people want data privacy. I mean, there's so many different things. And the question becomes, how do we implement it in a way that does the most good? And that's a harder question to answer. But I think if you can go into those questions and those conversations and just say, here's where I am, here's why I believe what I believe. But I realize that we are aligned on the same value. I realize that both of us want quality education and a bright future for our kids. Let's figure out how we write regulation that helps that happen. Let's figure out how we build an AI tool that helps that happen. And oftentimes I think that we agree on a lot more than we disagree on, or at least a lot more than we think we disagree on.
We're just warming up right here. I know we have a limit on time,
Absolutely.
and I'd love for this to be just the first conversation as part of several series. And honestly,
Sure.
I want the series to be as long as you could make time to be,
Sure.
because I think, again, like, these conversations are the type of conversations that are setting the foundation for better understanding AI ethical issues, so much that's in this. And I think what I've been seeing, what I've been exposed to online and offline, including very reputable conferences, is being actually reduced to what ChatGPT could do for certain
Right.
organizations, or how could that improve certain processes. And again, that's not in itself a bad thing, but I think that the foundation is in conversations like we had today I'd love to have you back here soon to make some time and continue very soon because it's fascinating. But what would be like just in closing of our conversation, something that will be a segue for a second part here for you? Any final thoughts?
I think really diving deeper into some of these things that are kind of perceived as the common risks and harms, right? I specifically think of economic harms. I hear a lot people concerned about the workforce, people concerned about the economy as a whole, and basically the question of, am I going to have a job? That's where I see a lot of this kind of debate happening. People think AI is going to replace them, so that's definitely one. There's questions of algorithmic bias and we touched on that some today, but that goes a lot deeper too in terms of, an example of this would be, preemptive policing. If you know that certain areas are more likely to show crime, or if you can predict with a high level of certainty that a certain person is going to commit a crime, right? Do you proactively police that person before they've done anything wrong, right? And that's where algorithmic decision making and algorithmic bias can actually really cause problems. Right? What about lending? Maybe somebody can't get a loan for a certain reason, right? And they had nothing to do to control it. It's just a matter of their upbringing and where they live and their demographic data, right? So there's a lot more we can go into kind of on that side, I think, and even into data privacy and security harms. But I personally just think addressing, these kind of these things that come out very black and white of like, AI is going to destroy our economy, right? And it's like that's a big claim when you think about it. And there's maybe some truth to certain aspects of that claim, but I'm always a big fan of kind of moving beyond the hype of these things, right? And actually, let's look at the data and let's figure out what it's actually going to do to the economy. Let's figure out, how we're going to handle this in lending and stuff like that, and if it's going to be as bad as everybody says it's going to be. So potentially, that's a segue we could go into.
Yeah, well, these fears have been around since the beginning of industrial revolution. When the steam
Yeah,
engine came out, people were extremely concerned that laborers will disappear, or like a lot of those jobs will be. And the reality is, a good part of them were eliminated, but then people had to learn how to manage the steam engines and how to build them and how to
right.
maintain them. So that create different
Yeah,
types of jobs. I think the fear that's being amplified in the current environment by AI is the speed at which it advances, which I think is like probably the fastest that we've experienced with any type of technology. And that actually accelerates the anxiety. And yes, I would love to start with that, our next conversation. I want to thank Ken for hanging out with us for the entire hour and just kind of read his comment to add it to the segue to our next conversation. History shows that humans rarely predict the real risk well. The real problems with AI won't come from the obvious dangers. It'll be subtle, insidious ways it changes human behavior, weakens institutions, and undermines trust. Kind of, I think, in line with one of the things that I pointed out earlier. It's not a machine that will kill us, it's how we use the machine that will ruin us. Thanks again, Ken. And Noah, many thanks for helping us getting this podcast off the ground. I'm extremely excited about the future and about this doing this series with you and look forward to more conversations to get you back here soon.
likewise. Thanks so much for having me, Adrian, and congrats on the launch of the podcast as well.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for hanging out with us today, for spending an hour out of your time to just be with us today. Amazing conversation. And we promise to be back here soon with a continuation. We're just getting warmed out. Have an amazing afternoon.